Why are Jews and Arabs always at war? Is it really about land, religion, power? Or is there something far older and far more spiritual? For centuries, this question has haunted prophets, kings, and scholars alike. Two peoples, descended from the same man, locked in a cycle of hatred that no treaty can break and no boundary can fix. Isaac and Ishmael. Two brothers. One father. Two destinies that split the world in half. We're told this is a political crisis. A cultural feud. A never-ending battle of empires. But what if that's only the surface? What if the root of this war lies not in governments, but in Genesis? This is not just history. This is prophecy. This is legacy. The Bible doesn't just record events, it reveals patterns. It whispers of family fractures that become global fault lines. The moment Sarah turned from Hagar, the moment Ishmael was cast into the wilderness, was the moment a spiritual divide took root in human soil. A divide that still bleeds today. But here's the twist few ever see: the Bible doesn't only tell us why they were divided. It reveals how, one day, they may be reunited. You see, the story of Isaac and Ishmael isn't finished. It wasn't finished when Abraham died. It wasn't finished in 1948. And it won't be finished until a greater reconciliation takes place, one not written by diplomats, but written by God. So if you've ever wondered why this conflict never ends, why Jerusalem burns while both sides claim to pray for peace, why two peoples from one father cannot stand side by side, then this story is for you. Because the deeper truth has been buried, not under rubble, but under religion, pride, and misunderstanding. And to uncover it, we must go back, not to war rooms or summits, but to a tent in the desert. To a barren woman, a desperate servant, and a promise that would tear the world in two. Stay with us. The story you're about to hear may change how you see the entire Middle East. And maybe even yourself. Part 1, One family, two bloodlines, two destinies. At the heart of every war lies a wound. And at the heart of the war between Jews and Arabs lies a wound that began inside one family. Not a nation. Not an empire. A family. It started with a promise. God spoke to a man named Abram, an ordinary nomad wandering through a land not his own, and gave him an extraordinary covenant. Through you, all the families of the earth will be blessed. Genesis 12. But as days turned to decades, the promise remained unfulfilled. Abram's wife, Sarai, was barren. In a world where a woman's worth was tied to her womb, her silence wasn't just personal, it was public shame. Sarai was not just childless. She was broken. She had a promise from heaven but no child in her arms. And so she did what many of us do when faith feels delayed. She acted. She offered her Egyptian servant, Hagar, to Abram. A substitute womb. A desperate solution. And Abram agreed. Hagar conceived. A son was born. His name, Ishmael, which means, God hears. It should have been a moment of joy. But instead, it fractured the house. Because Hagar, once invisible, was now powerful. Sarai, once noble, was now bitter. And Ishmael, though innocent, was caught in a storm he never created. This was not just jealousy. It was the beginning of a division that would shape history. And then, years later, when Abram was nearly a century old, God came again. He changed his name to Abraham, father of many, and declared the impossible. Sarai, now called Sarah, would bear a child of her own. A second son. A second path. A second destiny. His name would be Isaac, he will laugh. And suddenly, the house had two sons. Two bloodlines. But only one covenant. This is where the pain begins. Because while God promised to bless both sons, he chose only one to carry the line of the covenant. Isaac would be the heir. Isaac would inherit the promise. And Ishmael would be sent away. But not forgotten. Let's pause here, not just to analyze, but to reflect. Because in this ancient drama, we see a pattern that repeats in every generation. The pain of favoritism. The wound of rejection. The bitterness of being cast aside, even when you still carry the same blood. For 13 years, Ishmael had been Abraham's only son. He had walked with his father, prayed with his father, maybe even believed he was the chosen one. And then, suddenly, he became the other son. The one who would not inherit. The one removed from the center of the story. Can you imagine that? Can a soul survive being told, you were part of the plan, but not the promise? This is more than a story. It's the blueprint of a divide that has shaped empires and erupted into war for thousands of years. 2 sons. 2 mothers. 2 promises. 2 nations, forever tied, forever torn. But let's ask the question that lingers behind the facts. Was God unfair? Why did he choose Isaac and not Ishmael? The Bible gives no explanation based on merit. Ishmael did nothing wrong. And yet, God chose Isaac. Because the covenant, we're told, would not come through human effort, but through divine intervention. Isaac was born by a miracle. A barren woman. A withered man. Life where life was thought impossible. It was never about ability. It was always about divine intent. Ishmael was the result of human striving. Isaac was the fruit of faith. And that distinction, that spiritual inheritance, became the line that would split the ancient world. To the Jews, Isaac is the child of the promise. To the Muslims, Ishmael is the true heir. And so, the family fracture became a global fracture. This is the tragedy of Abraham's house. That 2 sons could not share the same tent, the same blessing, the same future. But maybe the deeper tragedy is this. That we, centuries later, are still choosing sides in a story meant to point us beyond bloodlines. Because if both sons were blessed, if both carried God's favor in different ways, then why are we still fighting over the inheritance? And more urgently, can 2 nations, born of one father, ever find their way back to the same grave? Not in war, but in worship. Part 2, the prophecy over Ishmael and the root of conflict. Long before empires rose and armies marched, before borders were drawn and maps were read, a prophecy was whispered in the wilderness. It wasn't spoken in thunder. It didn't echo through courts or temples. It came in a dry, forgotten place, spoken not to a king, but to a runaway slave. Her name was Hagar. She had been used, mistreated, cast out. She was a servant, pregnant, alone, and afraid, fleeing into the desert with no home and no hope. And there, beside a spring in the wilderness, an angel of the Lord found her. But instead of judgment, he gave her a message. A prophecy. A revelation that would shape not only her son, but the identity of an entire people. You shall bear a son. You shall call his name Ishmael, for the Lord has heard your affliction. He will be a wild donkey of a man. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand against him. And he will dwell in hostility toward all his brothers. Genesis 16. It sounds harsh, even offensive to modern ears. But this wasn't a curse. It was a reality foretold, one that still plays out across the pages of today's headlines. So what did it mean? In ancient cultures, a wild donkey wasn't a symbol of foolishness, it represented untamed freedom. A creature that lived outside the boundaries, beyond control, roaming the wilderness with no master. That was Ishmael. He would be strong, independent, fearless, a survivor. He would bow to no nation, no empire, no yoke. But with that freedom would come a cost, conflict. Because the untamed are rarely welcomed in a world built on borders and hierarchies. Ishmael's hand would be against many, not out of hatred, but because freedom often resists control. And the world, in turn, would resist him. This single prophecy became a mirror of history. For centuries, the descendants of Ishmael, what would become the Arab peoples, would walk this tension, fierce resilience matched by constant resistance. Independence clashing with power. Even today, we see this tension explode from within. Not just in the Israeli-Arab conflict, but in divisions between Sunni and Shia, in civil wars, in the struggle for identity within the Islamic world itself. Brother turns against brother. Nation fractures from within. All foretold in a desert prophecy few ever take seriously. But here's what many miss. God heard Hagar. The name Ishmael literally means, God hears. This is not the name of rejection, it's the name of divine attention. God did not ignore the pain of the outcast. He honored it. And in doing so, he planted a tension that would never fully resolve, because it wasn't meant to resolve through human hands. Let's pause for a moment. If Ishmael was blessed, if his birth was divinely acknowledged, if God heard the cry of a servant and saw her tears, then why do so many treat him as the unwanted son? Could it be that we, like Sarah, still struggle to accept a blessing that doesn't fit within our theology? Could it be that the church, and the world, has too often chosen Isaac and forgotten Ishmael? But God didn't forget him. When Ishmael was sent into the wilderness, God appeared again, not with judgment, but with provision. Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying. Lift him up, for I will make him into a great nation. Genesis 21. And so he did. 12 princes came from Ishmael, just as 12 tribes came from Jacob, the son of Isaac. 2 lines. 2 destinies. 2 mirrors of spiritual inheritance and earthly greatness. But there's the difference. Ishmael was promised nations. Isaac was promised covenant. One received strength. The other received purpose. And perhaps this is the root of the conflict. When identity is built on inheritance, but not on covenant. When strength is given without a spiritual mission. Then the struggle to define belonging never ends. Ishmael's descendants became kings, warriors, poets, and empire builders. From the golden age of Baghdad to the sands of Andalusia, their legacy shaped the world. But behind the strength, lingered a wound. The same wound that began in the tent of Abraham. Because in the moment Isaac was born, Ishmael didn't just lose his role, he lost his future. The promise shifted. The tent changed. The blessing moved. Can a child recover from that? Can a nation born of rejection ever feel whole? Maybe this explains why the struggle never truly ends. Because the war between Isaac and Ishmael is more than a war of nations. It's a war of memory. Of identity. Of who belongs and who was cast out. And until that is healed, not by politics, but by divine mercy, the prophecy will continue to echo. But prophecy, by its very nature, doesn't just describe. It points forward. So the deeper question is this. If God heard Ishmael once, does he still hear him now? And if so, what does that mean for the future of those who carry his name? Part 3, Isaac, the child of the covenant. If Ishmael was the son of survival, then Isaac was the son of the impossible. He wasn't born out of strategy or human timing. He was born out of silence and laughter. Sarah laughed when she heard the prophecy. At 90 years old, her womb was barren, her hope long buried. And yet, God spoke into the void and created life where life had no business being. At the appointed time, I will return, and Sarah shall have a son. Genesis 18. And so Isaac was born, not just as a child, but as a sign. A sign that God's promises were not built on human effort, but divine faithfulness. A sign that the covenant, the spiritual inheritance, would pass through miraculous intervention, not bloodline alone. But let's be honest, if Ishmael's story is tragic, Isaac's isn't easy either. From the beginning, his life carried the weight of prophecy. He was the one, the chosen seed, the fulfillment of a covenant that stretched far beyond his lifetime. Can you imagine growing up under that weight? Being told that the fate of nations, of salvation, of history itself, rests on your existence. It's no surprise that one of Isaac's earliest memories would be one of the most traumatic. A mountain. A father holding a knife. A sacrifice. God asked Abraham to take Isaac, the son of the promise, up Mount Moriah and offer him as a burnt offering. We often focus on Abraham's faith in this story. But what about Isaac? He wasn't a toddler. He was strong enough to carry the wood. Old enough to ask, "Father, where is the lamb?" And yet, he walked willingly. Not just as a son, but as a symbol. Because Isaac's entire life was about obedience and trust, even when the road seemed terrifying. In that moment, Isaac became more than Abraham's son. He became a prototype. A foreshadowing of another son. Who would one day carry wood up a hill? Who would ask his father if there was another way? Who would not be spared? But Isaac was spared. A ram appeared. The knife was stayed. The covenant continued. And from that moment forward, Isaac stood as a pillar in the divine narrative, not because of what he achieved, but because of what God declared over him. God reaffirmed to Isaac what he had spoken to Abraham. Through your offspring all nations on earth will be blessed. Genesis 26. This wasn't just about land or descendants. It was about a mission, to be a channel of divine blessing to all humanity. But here's where the mystery deepens. Though Isaac carried the covenant, he lived in the shadow of conflict. His wells were stopped up by enemies. He had to move repeatedly to find peace. Even within his own household, he repeated the family pattern. Favoritism between his sons, Esau and Jacob, would once again fracture a bloodline. History was repeating itself. Because covenant doesn't erase conflict, it reveals it. Let's ask a deeper question. Why did God choose Isaac over Ishmael? It wasn't because Isaac was morally superior. He lied, like his father. He played favorites, like his father. He made mistakes. But God chose him anyway. Why? Because covenant is not based on merit. It is based on God's sovereign plan. This offends many of us. We want to believe that chosenness is earned. That blessing is a reward. But Isaac's story tells us, covenant is a calling, not a competition. And with that calling comes responsibility. Because to be chosen is not a badge of pride, it's a burden of purpose. The Jews, as the children of Isaac, inherited this burden. To be a light to the nations. To keep the law. To carry the lineage that would lead to the Messiah. But they also inherited the weight. Persecution. Exile. Survival. Why? Because covenant attracts conflict. And the enemy of the promise is always resistance. That's why the tension with Ishmael never truly ended. It wasn't just sibling rivalry. It was spiritual resistance to the covenant itself. Isaac and his descendants would be surrounded on all sides, by ancient cousins turned enemies, by empires who wanted the land but not the God who gave it. And yet, they endured. From exile in Babylon to wandering in Europe, from the ghettos to the Holocaust. The seed of Isaac endured. Not because they were stronger, but because the covenant kept them. This is the secret few dare to say. Israel exists not because of politics, but because of prophecy. And prophecy cannot be erased. But with that comes another truth. If Isaac was chosen to be the bearer of the promise, then he was also chosen to be the bridge. Because a blessing meant for all nations must eventually reach back. Even to the son who was cast out. The covenant was never about exclusion. It was about timing. About preparation. About divine unfolding. And so we must ask, Could the child of the covenant also become the key to reconciliation? Could Isaac's descendants, through pain, survival, and covenant, be the ones called to bring healing to the fracture that began in their own house? The answer to that lies in a future still unwritten. Part 4, The Echo of Conflict Through Time. The tents of Abraham are long gone. The desert winds have buried their footprints. The voices of Sarah and Hagar no longer ring through the hills. But their choices echo still. And in that echo, we find the shape of history, etched not in stone, but in blood and memory. The conflict between the descendants of Isaac and Ishmael was not just a personal drama. It became a template for nations. Two brothers. Two promises. Two worldviews colliding through millennia. Not because they were doomed to war, but because their pain was never healed. Look at the Middle East today. It is more than a geopolitical hotspot. It is a spiritual battlefield where ancient stories still breathe. Every border dispute, every broken truce, every rocket fired and retaliation launched. It all carries the DNA of a family fracture. This is why treaties alone cannot fix the region. Because we're not just dealing with land. We're dealing with legacy. The children of Isaac, the Jewish people, scattered across the earth, carrying with them the memory of covenant, of temple, of exile, of return. The children of Ishmael, the Arab nations, rising into empire, spreading language, law, and religion across 3 continents, yet still haunted by the shadow of exclusion. And somewhere deep beneath the politics, the media headlines, the religious rhetoric, is the wound of rejection. You see, the Bible doesn't just give us prophecy, it gives us a mirror. And if we stare into that mirror, we see the reflection of a world at war with its own family. But here's the mystery. The conflict has morphed over time, mutating, multiplying, metastasizing. In ancient days, it was tribal. Later, it became religious, Judaism versus Islam. Then came nationalism, Zionism, Pan-Arabism, terrorism. All these isms are modern names for an ancient rift. Even Christianity, born from within the line of Isaac, found itself tangled in the conflict, sometimes standing with Israel, other times persecuting Jews, and still other times aligning with Arab causes. It's like no one is immune to the gravity of this fracture. And the deeper we go, the clearer it becomes. This is not merely a war of flesh and blood, but of spirit. It is about inheritance, identity, divine election. So why has peace been so elusive? Because reconciliation requires more than negotiation. It requires revelation. You cannot solve a spiritual riddle with political logic. And you cannot reconcile 2 nations if neither one knows who they truly are. Let's go deeper. What happens when 2 peoples both believe they are fulfilling God's plan? When both claim a sacred connection to the same land, the same Father, the same holy city? Jerusalem. It is the city of peace, that has rarely known peace. Jews pray toward it. Muslims revere it. Christians pilgrimage to it. And yet, it divides more than it unites. Why? Because Jerusalem doesn't belong to any one nation. It belongs to prophecy. And prophecy doesn't serve our politics. It unfolds on its own terms, in its own time. In many ways, the battle over Jerusalem is not about land. It's about who carries the blessing, and who carries the burden. And still, the echo grows louder. Each generation inherits not just the soil, but the sorrow. Not just the history, but the hostility. And we must ask, how long can a wound fester before it consumes the body? But here's the paradox. Despite centuries of war, displacement, and death, both peoples endure. Israel was reborn after nearly 2,000 years in exile. The Arab world, though divided, remains vast and influential. Both carry prophetic fingerprints. Because God has not erased either line. He has allowed both to grow, to struggle, To search. But perhaps, not to fully thrive, until something deeper is resolved. Because the echo of the conflict is not just horizontal, between nations. It is vertical, between man and God. As long as the sons of Abraham war with each other, they will remain estranged from the full peace of the Father. And this is the haunting truth the Bible whispers. The reconciliation of Isaac and Ishmael is not optional. It is inevitable, if prophecy is to be fulfilled. For Scripture tells us of a day when nations will no longer learn war. When swords will be beaten into plowshares. When every tribe and tongue will bow to the one true King. That day has not yet come. But its shadow draws near. And in that day, perhaps, the sons of Isaac and Ishmael will finally recognize that they were never enemies. They were brothers, meant to walk together, not apart. But for that to happen, something radical must occur. Not in politics. Not in military coalitions. But in the human heart. Because only a healed heart can stop repeating the echo. And only when the children of the covenant and the children of promise embrace a shared origin, can they walk toward a shared destiny. The echo is real. But echoes fade. When a new sound begins. Part 5, A Prophetic Hope. Can reconciliation still happen? The story begins in pain. But could it end in peace? Can a family once torn apart by prophecy and pride, by wounds too old to name and too deep to speak of, ever be made whole again? This is not just a political question. It is a prophetic one. Because long before treaties were signed and borders drawn, God already spoke of a future where brothers would not just survive, but reconcile. Let's go back to Ishmael. Before he became the father of many nations. Before Islam, before empires, he was a boy. Weeping in the wilderness. Abandoned. Alone. Thirsty. And in that moment of desolation, God heard him. God has heard the boy crying, Genesis 21. The Hebrew word for heard is shama. And it's the root of Ishmael's name. God hears. This is the seed of hope. That even those who feel cast out are not forgotten. Could it be that the path to reconciliation begins not with strength, but with acknowledging pain? You see, reconciliation does not mean forgetting the past. It means redeeming it. And here's the twist the world does not expect. The same God who chose Isaac also blessed Ishmael. He said, "As for Ishmael, I have heard you. I will make him fruitful and greatly increase his numbers. He will be the father of 12 rulers," Genesis 17. 2 sons. 2 blessings. But one source. This truth, if embraced, could shatter centuries of hatred. Because reconciliation doesn't begin with governments. It begins with identity. When Jews see Arabs not as enemies, but as estranged cousins. When Arabs see Jews not as oppressors, but as fellow sons of Abraham. That's where the healing begins. But how? Through human efforts alone? History would say no. Decades of negotiation have led to more division than unity. Because the problem is not on paper, it's in the heart. And yet, prophecy whispers something different. Isaiah spoke of a day when Egypt, Assyria, and Israel, 3 ancient enemies, would be united in worship. In that day Israel will be the third, along with Egypt and Assyria, a blessing on the earth. Isaiah 19. This is astonishing. Assyria is modern-day Iraq. Egypt is the heart of the Arab world. Israel, the covenant nation. Enemies by history. Allies in prophecy. Why would God say this? Because God's ultimate plan has never been about isolation, it's about invitation. The covenant given to Isaac was never meant to be a fortress. It was always meant to be a bridge. And that bridge leads to someone greater. A descendant of Isaac. A man who was both rejected and chosen. pierced for transgressions, yet raised in glory. Jesus. He is the true seed of Abraham, the one in whom both Jew and Gentile, both Isaac and Ishmael, both the child of the covenant and the child of exile, can be reconciled. Because at the cross, the curse was reversed. The wall of hostility came down. The separation was pierced. And now, a new family can be formed. Not by blood, but by faith. There is neither Jew nor Greek, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. And if you are Christ's, then you are Abraham's seed. Galatians 3. This is the final mystery. That reconciliation doesn't erase the story of Ishmael or Isaac. It redeems it. It brings them together. Not in compromise, but in completion. Imagine a world where Palestinians and Israelis pray together. Not toward opposite mountains, but toward the same Savior. Imagine Arab and Jew reading the same scriptures. Not as weapons, but as windows into the same Father's heart. This is not fantasy. This is the trajectory of prophecy. Because peace will not come through domination. It will come through transformation. And though the road there may still be long, and the tears many, the promise is secure. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Matthew 5. It was never about which son was greater. It was about what the Father wanted from the beginning. A family restored. So, can reconciliation still happen? Not by might. Not by diplomacy. Not by religion. But by a return to the author of both destinies. And that return begins with us. The Bible does not hide the wounds. It exposes them, so they can be healed. From the moment Isaac and Ishmael walked separate paths, a sacred fracture formed. One born of divine mystery and human choice. And that fracture, it still bleeds. In headlines. In holy cities turned to battlegrounds. In families raised to fear the other. In promises remembered differently by different peoples. But if the Bible is honest about the pain, it's also relentless in its hope. This is not just the story of two ancient brothers. It is the story of us all. Because we, too, know what it means to live in conflict. To carry inherited wounds. To wrestle with identity. To wonder who truly belongs, and who has been cast out. And in that wrestle, we find ourselves standing at the same crossroad as Abraham's sons. Will we continue to fight over blessings? Or realize that there is room for both in the Father's house? The Bible closes the gap with a startling truth. There is only one shepherd. Only one table. And the invitation to sit at it was never based on bloodline, but on belief. It is belief that heals. That binds. That restores. So when we ask, why are Jews and Arabs always at war? We are really asking, how long until brothers forgive? How long until the Father's house becomes a home again? How long until prophecy becomes peace? Because the Bible does not simply reveal a past that bleeds. It unveils a future that calls. A future where enemies embrace. Where swords are buried beneath olive trees. Where the children of Isaac and Ishmael worship not in competition, but in completion. And though we may not yet see that day, we are called to live like it's coming. To be voices that echo peace louder than war. To be witnesses that God does not forget families, even broken ones. History has spoken. Prophecy is unfolding. Now it's our turn to answer the call. Will we be part of the wound? Or part of the healing? The war may continue. But the story, God's story, is not finished yet.